Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Schanzer, the director for Peter Fever this year for American Grand Strategy Program. And we are thrilled today to have a terrific guest and a terrific event on, just like they say in Law and Order, ripped from the headlines topic about policing and protest. Our guest today is Juliette Kayyem, and she is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She's one of really our leading commentators. I've been following her for a long time, but we've just met, and I'm really happy to get to know her. She's really one of the leading commentators on Homeland Security in our country. She's frequently on CNN, a columnist for the Boston Globe. She's the author of a book called Security Mom, and she's also had some important positions in government as the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Security for Intergovernmental Affairs under the Obama administration, and also as the Homeland Security Advisor for Governor Deval Patrick, if I'm not mistaken, of Massachusetts. So we're thrilled to have her. And Juliette, welcome to virtual Duke University.
Love it. Nice to see you. And thank you everyone for joining. This is great.
Excellent. Well, let's dive into it. We're going to get to the things that are literally in the headlines the last couple of days. But first, there's a lot of confusion out there with all the different kinds of protests, different law enforcement agencies. And I thought it would be helpful for our audience to get everybody on the same foundation. So I want to ask you some questions that are going to kind of walk you through some of the basic principles. But before we get to, first I wanted to know, you advise governments and others, how to handle big security events, public events where there might be protests. Why don't you just walk through with me, explain to me the process if you're advising a mayor and there's going to be some sort of large scale event, public protest. You're not necessarily expecting violence, but you want to be prepared for everything. Walk through it with me, how you would talk about it, how you decide on where and how many police, what kinds of equipment should they have. Walk me through that.
That's great. So first of all, thank you. And this is truly ripped from the headlines. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening on the streets now. So, everyone knows, and this is, it's great that the program is called American Grand Strategy, because what I often say about Homeland Security is that security is the easy part. It's our homeland that's difficult, because really the challenge for us is a governance challenge in the Homeland Security realm. So, I know you had Susan Rice last week, when you think about nation to nation, we kind of have a sense of how that works and who's in charge. Well, the United States is very, very different. We not only have 50 states and territories and tribes, do not forget tribes and cities, but our constitutional structure, our governance structure under the 10th Amendment delegates to states that often delegate to the cities traditional police powers. So we don't have a centralized sort of policing effort. We have federal law enforcement agencies, but their jurisdictions are limited to essentially federal jurisdiction. So like immigration. And so you're dealing with 50 different governors and cities and mayors and politics and communities that are going to react differently. So from the police perspective, and I oversaw police departments. I make it clear I was not a first responder. I oversee public safety agencies like the National Guard stuff. So a governor or mayor will have access to essentially law enforcement capability. And your number one, or your two priorities are the lawful exercise of First Amendment rights, which most police departments get now. And the other is to deconflict, or to ensure that you are anticipating potential conflict. That conflict will often not be between police and protesters, but between protesters and counter-protesters, as we've seen a lot of times. Other people will show up, right? And so Charlottesville is a perfect example. I don't blame anyone but the Nazis and the Nazi and the protesters, or not the protesters, but the ralliers there for what happened. But looking back and in the after action reports, given the intelligence that the police department was seeing, knowing what was going to happen, that there was going to be both the Nazi rally, which was nationally organize as well as counter rallies. They could have done a lot more, as they've recognized now, in terms of ensuring that you don't want people meeting on a corner. And so there's lots of ways to sort of de-escalate potential conflict, let people get all their energies out. For the most part, protesters are not violent. The second thing is to make sure that the police are not viewed as picking a side or another. I think we're seeing some of those challenges right now. And so often we do that by recommending not having the heavy artillery, right? In other words, you want the police officers to be familiar with the community. So if it's in an African-American part of the city, those police officers that generally patrol there should be the ones out and about. They're known, and not to be ready for conflict. You see some of these people, some of these police departments, you know, the militarization of the police departments come out, and you're like, you know, they've got the shield and the big guns and they're surrounded by tanks. You're like, what do you think's going to happen, right? So we do have tools to try to de-escalate, and that's your primary, as a law enforcement, that's your primary priority. And then as a mayor, so you've got the police, as a mayor or a governor, using all the tools you have, right? So, and we've seen this now with the governor and mayor in the last day or so, you know, to try to de-escalate through communication strategy, through having other leaders come forward if there's a, you know, if there's a police misconduct or a police shooting, an unjustified police shooting, you know, the governor or the mayor may not necessarily be the best spokesperson. So we do have tools for this. You're just seeing, you know, it's just a lot of conflict now.
How does the fact that most of these protests this summer have been directed at the police, so the police are the kind of the targets of the ire, and they are the ones that, you know, for lack of any other tool, the ones that also have a public safety responsibility and are deployed. How does that walk through again, how that kind of maybe changes?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what we have to remember is thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of these Black Lives Matter protests have gone on at each incident, and without so much as conflict, right? In other words, for the most part, even if the protest is against police misconduct, most people protesting have no interest in taking on the police, right? I mean, one is they understand that the police are also part of a community to keep a community safe. I mean, the idea that people in the African-American community, as an example, don't also recognize the need for law enforcement is ridiculous. This is something I think that's played in the political space and is, you know, is caricatured. So we have to be, you know, cognizant that those are good. So most of these are peaceful protests. You never have, in most of these instances, you never have any conflict. You have police departments, in many cases, the police departments that have been successful having community relations with the protesters, whether it's a police chief. This is why this is why you want police departments to look like the communities that they patrol, and where they don't, this is where you often have problems like Ferguson, and as well as community outreach efforts. So for the most part, except when, you know, we'll talk about this, when things sort of ratchet up, for the most part, you know, I think police departments sort of recognize what's going on. And you saw police departments take the knee. You saw them recognize that, you know, they could also be against police misconduct, right?
So, as you said, when things ratchet up and violence either is part of a protest, or there's peaceful protests that then, you know, sometimes when the night falls and the curfew falls, you get people who are not part of the protest but are coming out, and there is violence. And you know, we have seen things that are more akin to a riot and arson and so on than a peaceful protest. You sometimes hear the governor is calling out the National Guard. Yeah. So what is the threshold? You've said you've advised and supervised the National Guard. What is the kind of purpose for when you hear that happening. And these are these National Guard are military military personnel who have military training and military equipment. So why do we do that?
So basically, it's essentially to have support capacity for police. It's not just police departments, emergency management, and other first responder agencies. So people often don't understand the National Guard, so I'll just quickly go through it. They have 3 different statuses. So one, and I won't get into all the numbers, but so one status is the active military, that they actually get deployed abroad. They work for the Pentagon. The president is the commander in chief. The governor loses control of them in that instance. So that's not in play here. There's 2 state statuses that are relevant. In other words, when they are in the state. The first is that they are under the governor. And this is what you often see either in natural disasters or what you see in some states, which is the governor simply says, I'm going to use the troops for whatever purpose, sometimes law enforcement purposes, to support law enforcement to ensure that we can maintain crowd control. This is highly trained, understood as part of the potential mission, and not sort of done willy-nilly. So governors are sort of often reluctant to do it because they understand that this is a military mechanism, but in that status, the National Guard is owned by the governor. There's a third status. It's a little bit more complicated. It's when there's a federal interest, like for example, post 9/11, but so that they're activated, but they still reside under a governor, but the feds pay. So it's just basically a payment process that comes into play. So and so those 3 statuses are the ones that we understand. And so a president generally is not allowed to deploy active military in the United States because it violates a whole bunch of things, but it violates, a lot of people will have heard of this law, the Posse Comitatus law, right? So it basically, I'm gonna shorthand it, it's got a lot of caveats, but basically you cannot use federal law enforcement, federal military for law enforcement purposes. And this is what was so shocking about Lafayette, and also not shocking about the Pentagon's recoiling after Lafayette, because they are trained not to do this, right? They understand that they cannot be utilized as a sort of political arm, a political law enforcement arm of a White House. The exception to that, and this is why you hear the president say it so much, is essentially the exception. Well, we could litigate this another time, but essentially the exception is the Insurrection Act, that a president can utilize the military for law enforcement purposes to enforce federal law when there is essentially an insurrection. Insurrection can be defined in a variety of ways. We understood it as the civil rights, when governors failed to abide by Supreme Court rulings to desegregate schools. So the various presidents would essentially utilize the military to help those kids in the LA riots. You also had federal troops that were used for law enforcement purposes because basically, the governor and mayor had asked for it. Hurricane Katrina did not happen. The troops were not federalized, which is, some people think maybe they should have, because that was the equivalent. It wasn't an insurrection, but it was the equivalent of the failure of government being able to function. So there's a lot of debate about it, but I don't think anyone, no rational view of what's happening on the streets in any of these cities would view any of that as akin to an insurrection. It's civil unrest, it's violence, it's property violence, it's sometimes death, as we've seen recently. But that's an insurrection. You want your triggering event to be much higher.
So just to reiterate what you were talking about, National Guard is almost always, except when they're federalized by the president, to go do usually something abroad or do disaster recovery. They anticipate that they're going to be used for domestic purposes, and they are trained for this. Whereas active duty military, other than the specialized military police, and even they are it's still very different than your cop in New York City in terms of their training. They are absolutely not trained to deal with civilians, to deal with the large-scale protests, people who have First Amendment rights.
Right. It's
That's
not.
their training, and that's why we make. I mean, not from a legalistic sense, but from a pragmatic sense. That's why we make this very big decision where National Guard governors can deploy to help, but active duty military generally hardly ever.
Right. And that's that's exactly right. And that's a sentiment that is sort of inculcated in the militaries. I think progressives or people on the left tend to think that the military wants to do this. I mean, when Lafayette happened, I'll be honest with you, it was shocking in a million ways for me, including a sort of, concern that the military had been captured in some way. And so I was very pleased by the almost immediate recoiling by Miley and others about what happened, and a sort of reset that whatever happened that day is not going to happen again. And you hear Miley, the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense sort of repeating that as we head into election, countering a narrative by the president that he would deploy military to protect from civil unrest during the election.
So I was just doing a little research beforehand, maybe otherwise, about you say Lafayette Park, or some people call it the St. John's Church incident, that the forces that were there clearing the area were Secret Service, U.S. Park Police, District of Columbia National Guard, and police from Alexandria, Virginia. So I guess it was a sense that the National Guard was there, or
and Miley. So when the Joint Chiefs,
it was his presence specifically.
Yeah, it was his. You couldn't believe it. Like, I mean, you shouldn't see the head of the Joint, chief of staff walking around talking to protesters. I mean,
he was in fatigue. And right? He was in fatigues, which was something.
I know, exactly.
But he wasn't in fatigues because he was there to order the troops around. He had been doing something prior to coming to the White House where it was appropriate to be wearing fatigues. He came to this meeting and then marched out there, and it looked horrible.
Yeah, it looked horrible. And he quickly reset it. I mean, my understanding from contemporaries and news reports is he was horrified because that's not, and that's not what they're trying to do. And, he recently, I guess he was on air or in the statement, said that they would not be utilized, countering a narrative by the White House. They would not deploy for election purposes, which one doesn't even understand what the reason would be. But I think there's a line in the sand.
You also have the weird situation there where the DC National Guard, as I understand it, is under potentially direction of the president compared to a city, or well, it is a city, but the mayor doesn't have control of it. Let's help people with the Portland incident, because that's even a little bit different. Here you had protests in Portland going on for many weeks, close to, but not exclusively, around a piece of federal property, the courthouse. And then in July, the Trump administration sent 114 federal officers, and again, I did a little research on this, from Customs and Border Protection, ICE, the Federal Protective Service, all of which were part of your old department, DHS, and I understand there were also U.S. Marshals there, which would be, I think, Justice Department.
DOJ, yeah.
So how did that come? What was the basis for that deployment, and is this lawful, or just or from a policy perspective, what are the issues there? Right.
So ideally, when you're the Department of Homeland Security, and you deploy outside of your core competencies, so say border, it would be at the request of a mayor and a governor. In other words, the idea, so this is just practical, I'm not talking legal. The idea of launching federal law enforcement into a city that has a major police department, you're basically asking for potential friendly fire. I mean, no, because they haven't trained together. There's no integrated chain of command. There's no unity of effort. You're just sending, which we do at the border, but that's because the border is the federal government's. We understand that, right? But Portland is, so the legal argument, and I put it in quotes because it's being debated, is that because there was a federal courthouse, which is and federal judges who are protected by the U.S. Marshals at DOJ, and then an entity called the Federal Protective Services (FPS) at DHS, that became the trigger for the deployment of federal law enforcement to protect those facilities and arguably federal employees in those facilities. There's just no question about it. You can think maybe they have an argument. That was just sort of an extension of most people's understanding of how you would want to deploy federal law enforcement. There's also other issues involved. They did not identify themselves. They essentially just showed up. They were taking people into vans without, your normal law enforcement protections to protesters. And I think it's safe to say it was a little bit of thuggery. Like there was no transparency. DHS, and once it was sort of clear that that it was arguably a legal or illegal deployment, DHS quickly recoiled, as did DOJ. There's been threats of utilizing again, most recently, of course, in some of the protests in the last 2 weeks. But we haven't seen it again. We may see it. Acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf sent a letter to, I think, a couple of mayors today, essentially saying, get your house in order or else we're going to deploy federal law enforcement agencies. But I don't, that's, I don't know if that's just a threat.
Were you taken aback by the lack of identification?
Yes.
That seemed like we don't have a federal paramilitary
right.
in this country for good reason. And have you learned or heard anything why that was possibly done and why these trained? We have highly trained. Our federal
right.
law enforcement entities are highly trained.
Yeah, and they identify themselves. And what was interesting is in Portland, people will remember that the FBI distanced themselves from the deployment. The FBI, the head of the FBI there, basically said, we're not, this is our community. We identify ourselves. We go after criminals. This is not our thing. So you saw a lot of tension, I think, within this. You have a very, very assertive, aggressive, or scared, pick your verb, Secretary of Homeland Security, who will do the White House's bidding. So if you ask me sort of what's the weak link leading into the election, like what do I worry about in terms of an excessive use of federal authority, I think Chad Wolf has proven himself to be the most willing to push the envelope in terms of the deployment of federal entities, much more so, of course, than you saw at the Pentagon, and maybe DOJ is somewhere in between them. DOJ, the FBI, whatever you think of DOJ right now, the FBI, I would think a lot had changed, and not for the good, if you saw a lot of FBI deployment during the election. There's a caution and a careerism there that does not exist, obviously, at the Department of Homeland Security because it's so new. I should say, and I don't want to, it has become clear either through law enforcement, federal law enforcement unions, like CBP, Customs and Border, and ICE, immigration, as well as some of the things that you're seeing, at least discussed and monitored and reported on. There is a very, I don't know, right wing is the right word, but there's a very anti BLM, anti-progressive politics sentiment within some of these law enforcement agencies that is very disconcerting. And you see the rise of Nazism and other stuff. These guys are sometimes on websites that they shouldn't be on, and that has to be rooted out. It's unacceptable. But there is that current. It's not every police officer, but it's not nothing, and that's a real problem that we're going to have to address.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. I wanted to ask you the depth of this, and I wanted to quote Doc Rivers, the coach of the LA Clippers, who came out and said, and this is the way a lot of Black people are feeling. And I'm not talking about the police use of force and the shootings, because that's a topic for a different event, but I'm talking about the treatment of the protests and the dignity and respect that either protesters are given or feel that they should be given and aren't. And he said, we come out to protest and they dress up in riot gear. But then white protesters, and he didn't say white, he said they, but protesters come to the Michigan and they spit on the cops and that nothing happens to them. And there's this sense of a differential treatment of protesters depending on what they're protesting. And we saw some of that with the anti-COVID lockdown protests. So I wonder what you made of that, if you feel is that overblown, or is it, I think you suggest there's an element of truth to that. And,
I think there is.
What can we do? I mean, how can society address that?
Yeah, so, it's a great, and I think it is, and I think some of these, well, let me step back and sort of because I think the police are a reflection of something going on in this country. So people who read my work and for The Atlantic, and I left the Globe, I'm with The Atlantic now. People who or follow sort of what's going on in radicalization. So I don't believe ideologies die. So Nazism survived World War II, and racism survived the Civil Rights Movement and anti-discrimination laws. They get muted, they lose their leadership, they get less popular, but they still exist. And so what keeps them at bay is a lot of different things: recruitment, money, all sorts of, But a huge part of what keeps them at bay is the shaming by society. If you have a Nazi tattoo on your neck, you are not likely to get hired in many places, right? And it's a totally legitimate reason to not. You're not going to get tenure at a university, that's for sure, right? That there's a shaming, rightfully so. It's not silencing, it's not cancel culture. It is that a society makes the rightful decision that there are shameful ideologies. So Nazism, jihadism, the violent jihadism, or I'll cross the gamut, or racism. So what's happened in the last 5 or 10 years? So it's not all related to President Trump. So 3 things have combined in the United States to create this mix that we're in, that's reflected in the police departments. So the first is essentially demographics. About 10 years ago, it became the first year in the United States where non-white babies, citizens, outnumbered white babies, citizens, right? So you're looking at the demographics, and that's great. That's the country we are. This is now where we're going to be a majority. I don't even know if you could call it a majority minority, but a majority non-white nation, just given the demographics. That created in the right wing and the white supremacist groups this sense of displacement, and it's called the displacement theory. That the idea that that the African American couple moves in next to you, right? You may not like it, right? The displacement ideology is, if they exist, I can't. Right. So this is the thinking, right? That thinking that is, I follow all the websites where that thinking, right? That the pie is not large enough, and that they are taking more of the pie because they're outbirthing us, so to speak. Then combined with the rise of social media, so that you could have these ideas and then meet with all of your friends online and have a sense that you were not alone, right? So this is what we're seeing in police departments, is all of these super squirrely Facebook pages or whatever, they're like literally fighting each other, right? So I have said often, there's no such thing as a lone wolf. Get that out of your head. They have a community, and that's fed by Facebook and other and worse platforms like 4chan and 8chan and all that stuff. The third, and this is where I think the last couple of years are unique, and unique in a bad way. The third is the non-shaming. So I call this, not just I, but this is a theory of radicalization that people may have heard me and others say, called stochastic terrorism. It is when leadership, whether it be a leader, a political leader, or a political party, or a local community leader, unshames the ideology that society would ought to shame. And so it's the both sides aspect, right? And so it has a fancy term called stochastic terrorism. It is the use of a platform to incite anger, hatred, violence, terrorism, whatever you want to call it, that whose likelihood is greater because of the statement, but whose exact contours can't be known, right? So you're just elevating the excitement. That's the incitement aspect. So you're not directing, you're not bin Laden, you're not directing the activity, right? You're not saying go blow up two embassies or four airplanes, but you are elevating and not shaming the violence. So I often say, it's like, and I'm, not to get too political, but we kind of need to bring shame back into this nation. Like, I want people to be shamed, right? And this is the problem, is we're not shaming enough. It was a valuable tool.
Well, you use the term shaming, but what people, it's been the euphemism for shaming, and some people don't like this, is the whole idea of, the attack against so-called political correctness. The idea of political correctness is the idea of shaming for not antisocial kind of bad conduct. And the idea of political correctness among some, took on a negative connotation, but you're kind of giving it a useful connotation by saying this is important shaming to suppress certain bad ideas. Right.
It's, in other words, what political correctness is, or, I get it. And that's the, that's let me put it a different way. Those who argue that just don't like being criticized. In other words, we are a diverse society now. Those ideas about white culture, white supremacy, could coexist or could exist at a time when people like me with a Lebanese background, or African American leaders, or women, or Hispanics didn't have platforms. We have platforms now. So guess what? We're in the arena. You can claim it's political correctness, or you can claim, a society can choose without any apology, right? That there's not two sides to Nazism. It's just, I think we're there now as a nation, right? And I think that political correctness play, or the counterculture play, is not just manipulated by really bad people, I think, like the neo-Nazi groups or the racist groups, but for some reason has appeal in sort of intellectual discourse. And, yes, there's gradations of racism, whatever. I think we can all agree that there are certain viewpoints that are not both sides. So I worry about that less. I worry, the thing that always cracks me up is, everyone yells about counterculture. It's the most famous people who are yelling about, cancel culture. Like, I was like, no one's canceling you. You have your own TV show. Like, it's, it's like, I'm the one who's like begging for attention. So it always cracks me up when the people with the greatest megaphones worry about cancel culture. I was like, I think, until the airwaves look a little bit different, I think you're safe.
Let me ask you one more question. Let me tell the audience we're going to move to your questions. You have the option to type them in the chat if you want to get your question asked, and we will start recognizing you. But one other question from kind of the other direction on the political spectrum. President Trump said when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Vice President Biden came out and gave very forceful statements yesterday about looting, arson, rioting is not protest and it should be prosecuted. But there has been some writing and discussion about looting as a form of protest, idea of a protest against the kind of hegemony of property and the lack of services and sustenance, especially at the time of COVID, for certain communities, and therefore, in some ways, looting is in some ways justified as a form of civil disobedience, a form of protest. And I want to give you a chance to react to that as well. I think there's a book just out.
No, I get it. I understand it. You're talking to, I may be progressive, but I'm a public safety Democrat. I just, I think, and, so I just basically don't agree with that sentiment I'm for getting on the streets. I've got teenagers who went out to the BLM rallies. I was in huge fights with them because of COVID, and it's, I am all for that, but I do, physical, first of all, the distinction between looting and something else is pretty thin from a public order perspective, but also, to me, it is not a legitimate form of First Amendment exercise, and for the most part is not held by a large segment of the protesting population. Look at the suburban moms that came out. They're not looters. They're just pissed,
Okay, I wanted to give you a chance to react to that. All right, we have Nathan Finney, Duke student, and we're going to try to unmute him so we could ask this question.
Hi, Nathan.
Hi, Professor Kayyem. Appreciate your talk. My question essentially revolves around weapons and the bringing of weapons to these type of things. So what should federal, state, and local agencies be doing to prevent the inclusion of weapons in the protests on either side? And I'm really kind of looking towards what are the technical, tactical, legal actions that be taken to prevent them from even showing up.
Yeah. So, obviously the laws create a baseline for what is acceptable in terms of what kind of weaponry you can have. So, open carry states are going to be very different than, say, Massachusetts, which has just, very strong gun control laws. So that serves as your baseline. So in a lot of jurisdictions, you're going to have this, hopefully the calming influence in terms of what a culture expects of not having weapons. That doesn't mean everyone. It's just that when you look at something that happens in Texas, right, and you see all these people with weapons, as compared to Massachusetts, where you see you see bikes, right? So one is that the rules are going to be different. There's a couple things. One is open forum organization is fair game for intelligence gathering. Like if groups are communicating on Facebook about, going to protect certain property or whatever, through the use of weapons, that to me would justify either the closing of, sometimes intelligence is not that specific, but the closing of certain areas, the more intensive deployment of of police, to simply use a show of force, which the population at large would probably want at that stage. So in a lot of these instances, like the most recent ones, there was pretty strong evidence that these were organized out of state and were promoting gun, basically the use of guns or the carrying of guns. But it is one of the hardest things. Look, I think states are going to have to get smarter about their open carry laws, in particular around, say, federal facilities or political facilities. So my last point is like, so Virginia, I remember when Virginia was having issues, I forget, isn't it crazy? I forget what it was in response to. It wasn't Charlottesville, it was later. But when Virginia was having issues, they passed a short-term emergency exception to the open carry rules that they had.
Maybe there was a rally at the State House, I think, in Virginia.
Yeah, right.
Was causing it was a Second Amendment rally, I believe.
Right, exactly. That's right.
I could be mistaken, but I think I read that here in North Carolina, which we do have pretty lax open carry laws. It is, however, it remains a crime to bring a firearm and open carry at a protest.
Yeah.
So, there are ways of doing that. Okay, we're going to turn to Nicole, PhD student here.
Oh, good.
Hi, so I'm actually a faculty member here.
Oh, I'm a PhD.
I have a PhD, yes.
That's my middle name, so.
Oh, wonderful. So my question is about, so I saw an interview with a police officer in London saying, sometimes we just let the protesters tear down the statues because no one's, it's not a human life when someone's tearing down a statue. So in the United States and in American policing, are there specific procedures or criteria by which to determine when the police should intervene versus when human life is more precious?
Right, yeah, so there are. So, I mean, obviously the protection of life is primary. And so this is why, like, for example, once again, cannot remember which incident it was in the last year. So often, like with CNN, like I was on air at the time, like often at CNN, like, maybe protesters will, they set on fire a McDonald's or a Burger King, and like, Wolf Blitzer is like yelling and like, I love him, so that's not mean, but it's just like, yeah, that's a good imagery. And I was like, you know what, they're not going to just let it burn. Like, they're not going to put, your priorities are twofold. One is protection of civilian life. The other is protection of your first responders. You are not going to send a bunch of unarmed firefighters to save a McDonald's that's probably insured and is going to be built back up. So there are standards. So it's actually, the first would be protection of your first responders, and then the protection of civilian life. And then the rest is just a judgment call based on, are you likely to either put other civilians in harm's way if you don't deal with the looting or the statue, right? So, or are you likely to risk the safety and security of a first responder, in particular a police officer? So a lot of times you'll see them just say, they turned over a car. I'm not going to deploy 20 cops into that, because that's going to, to my first point at the beginning of that is going to exacerbate the tensions. It's just a freaking car. So those are judgment calls based on the ground, but there's definitely sort of general or a general rule structure. And so for things like arson or fire, because firefighters are not armed, people tend not to go after firefighters, to be honest. Like, even protesters love fire, and most people like firefighters. So, but nonetheless, you are not going to put them at risk.
Thank you.
Okay, this is from Parker Harris. He says, in situations where you have protesters and counter-protesters together, is there a point short of one group being overly violent towards the other where the police should pick a side? Thinking of images of police officers joining BLM protesters that have been in the news.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I think the BLM is a really interesting point. I think the most recent police misconduct cases, televised, people shot in the back, people choked over long periods of time. And, I think that the sort of siding with BLM was more emotive than strategic. Like, I do think that, you know, I do abide by, I think most police officers are pretty good people. I've known them all my life. There is a sentiment of them that, that needs to be rooted out. The police unions would have been really smart 20 years ago to root these guys out, because every problem that we're having today is because the police unions make it impossible to get rid of people who have complaints. None of these police officers woke up one day and shot someone in the back 8 times. I mean, you look back, this is, you know, their 4th killing. Most police officers go through an entire career and having killed no one, right? You know, I mean, that's success, right?
Even having discharged their firearm.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just not, you're trained not to do that, right? And you know, this is, often you'll hear people who don't understand police training say, well, the protesters were throwing water bottles at the police officers. I was like, they're trained to anticipate that. Like, this is crazy. Like, the idea that that justifies shooting is crazy, right? That this is, so I do think some of that was very emotive. I think that some of these cases have just cut to the core of how police departments view themselves. And so take away the noise of the police union heads, right? Because those guys are not, most of them don't represent the sentiment of very diverse police departments. You'll notice almost all of them are white, sort of old school police officers. And the noise of, you know, the sort of Blue Lives Matter, the idea that Black Lives Matter is somehow against cops, right? Rather than being for, you know, fairness in policing. I think you had a really emotive sentiment. Where I think police departments pick side is just basically if you have an outnumbered group. So you don't want to pick sides necessarily based on ideology, you know, and often it's not as clear as, like, you know, Nazi versus anti-Nazi. That's a sort of easy example. But you want to just ensure that those who might be potentially harmed if things were to escalate have some protection. That's why Charlottesville was a perfect example. If you just look at the after action reports, basically you had a Nazi, very small, let's just put this in perspective, a Nazi group activating the city, right? Everyone's upset. Thousands of community members against the Nazis somehow convert, like literally on a street corner, sort of converge like this. This is what, they didn't have any traffic controls. So that's why the cars were able to get in. So just from a planning perspective, if your goal is, I want to de-escalate everything, right? I don't like the Nazis, but they're allowed to protest, or they're allowed to congregate. I've got a community that doesn't want them there. What's, you know, thinking about ways in which you de-escalate it.
Juliette, let's turn to this question of kind of where we're heading and police reform issues. You know, the term defund the police does have a lot of meaning to some, and but I think the most powerful, to me, some of the most powerful arguments from the movement is that, you know, police have been asked to, in modern society, just like the military, and when they do, you know, do both peacekeeping and nation building, are being asked to do things well outside of what they're trained for, what they're good at, that police have been as well. You know, responding to certain kinds of disputes, maybe domestic violence disputes where there's no, and so where do you see the most fruitful areas potentially for police reform, that maybe after the election and we get to actually trying to do some things in the country again? We might see some progress.
I would put it in 3 areas. So, I mean, the first is, and I'm not joking about this, union protections. I think Democratic mayors have let these unions negotiate the most absurd protections for really bad police. So it is a Democratic Party problem. It is not Republican mayors. There are not many Republican urban mayors left. And part of it is they don't want to take on the police. Part of it is, you know, the police are so powerful. Look at when de Blasio first was elected, and the police turned their back on him. but we've got to get some new leadership, new mayoral leadership in the Democratic Party to not allow these unions to protect really bad people. And you know, whether it's, you know, all the protections that you've read about, but, you know, whether the complaint process, you know, has to be adjudicated administratively before criminal, and how, you know, unpaid leave, all this stuff, it's you would not fathom it in almost any other employment situation, right? And so that's the first thing. So I'd love to see some Democratic mayors get a little backbone, instead of talking about, they're not, but, you know, instead of defund the police, which I think defund the police means make the police better, right? I mean, in other words, there's a lot of, you got to unearth that terminology. So that would be one. The second is I would go back to the Obama rules about the selling of military gear to any police department, that I would prohibit it to any police department that does not have a designated tactical team. So you can still sell it or allow them to utilize. So LA probably should have a SWAT team, right? You know, New York probably should have a SWAT team. Ferguson does not need it, right? So there's ways to distinguish between risk and non-risk, right? And so, but instead what happened was, you know, the 9/11 funds, this is all Homeland Security money, come out. There's so much money. Every police department, you know, sees a terrorist under the bed. They justify the purchase of this stuff. It's then closed down at the later parts of the Obama administration during Ferguson. You can still sell to designated tactical teams, which seemed right to me. And then that rule was rescinded at the beginning of the Trump administration. So I would reinstitute that rule. And then third is just go back to, you know, just basically your point, which is where the police are not necessary, even if it's a 911 call, deploy other resources. So our problem is 911 is a trigger for police activity, right? It's just the way the dispatch works, right? So we've got to be just more sophisticated about that. They don't want to do it. You know, armed police officers, you know, coming into to most domestic disputes, to most drunken behavior, right? I mean, these are not necessary for your typical police conduct. So I live in Cambridge. So on my corner we used to be, I mean, still there, but it's closed, you know, one of the more fun bars in Cambridge. You know, people would come out yelling and throwing up or whatever they do. And every Saturday there's just this deployment of police, and you're just thinking, you know, we're like one step away from something bad happening, right? Is that actually necessary? These people are just drunken misbehavior. So those are the three things that I think could get done. But once again, this is not, you know, if I blame one party for, you know, sentiments that I think should be shamed, right? And for a president who exacerbates it, I do think this is an opportunity for Democratic mayors, instead of defunding the police, to make sure that the representatives of the police are doing the police departments a favor, right? I mean, most police officers don't want this to be the conversation.
Okay, we have two more questions. I'd like to get to those and thank everyone.
Thank you.
So we have Francis, a Duke, let's see, that would be a sophomore. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, I can speak. Earlier, you mentioned the need to root out far-right cliques within federal law enforcement agencies. In light of many of the organizations that exist, how can the federal government expect to increase political neutrality and professionalism among so many different groups?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think first, professionalism is, you know, it's a culture that takes time. I don't want to say department is new, but it's relatively new compared to, say, the FBI. So the FBI has gone through major transformations. I know a lot of people don't like them and remember what they did, whatever, but for the most part, there's a professionalism and the standard, right? That is consistent. We don't have that in a lot of the federal law enforcement agencies that are relatively new to the post 9/11 world. So I think there are ways, and lots of secretaries of Homeland Security try to do it, but to try to create culture, professionalism, training, education, and a leadership that's coming up, right, that understands that. And one of the challenges, I think, in the last couple of years is that you've had the department basically simply viewed as an immigration enforcement department, when it's actually much more. And so I do think that there's ways to fix that and to build that professionalism over time. I think it's going to take leadership at the department. I'm thinking of the Department of Homeland Security most specifically, to try to elevate those, to provide opportunities for that culture, for that education, for that training, for a new generation. But it's a challenge. But look, the Secret Service is part of DHS, and it brought its culture and its professionalism. It still has problems, as we know. It's, got into some messes, but for the most part, has been able to retain a objective culture in the midst of the Homeland frenzy, right? For the most part.
Okay, and finally, we have one of our senior federal national security fellows. I know you have the Kennedy School, you've got a great program, and we were able to model it after yours. And this year we're hosting 7 fellows from state, DOD, the Army, and the FBI. And one of them, John Harvey, is with us. So John.
Hi, John.
Hi, ma'am. Thanks for spending time with us today. So I was interested in some of your early comments about the Insurrection Act. It's been invoked 22 times in our history for Embargo Act violations, labor disputes, post-election arrests in Louisiana, desegregation enforcement, 9 times in response to riots.
Yeah.
You said that the current ongoing unrest that we have kind of nationwide in mostly major cities, but all over the country, does not meet the threshold to invoke the act. I'm interested in what you believe, or should be the litmus test, or what is the threshold then for president to invoke the act?
It's a great question. And so, I mean, so obviously, there's 2 ways to think of the Insurrection Act. So one is just disobedience against federal law. So that's your civil rights case, right? So it's a governor saying, I don't abide by the Supreme Court. I'm not letting these Black children do this. So that's well understood. The other is the more complicated one, which you clearly touch on, which is also under the Constitution, the federal government has to guarantee to the states a Republican form of government, R, not party, but Republican as in representative form of government. So when the form of government, right, in other words, its ability to administer governance is challenged or is undermined, that would satisfy the insurrection. So this is why the governor and the governor of California and the mayor of LA asked for it, right? Because they said, we've got prisons on fire, we've got police departments on fire, we've got courts on fire. We're not guaranteeing essentially Republican r form of government. This is why someone like me, who generally recoils, let me be clear. The military is absolutely necessary in a support function for all of the mayhem that we're facing, everything from hurricanes and fires to potential distribution of a vaccine. So I'll just end with this. So I do think that Bush, and Bush sort of feels this way, did make a mistake by not invoking the Insurrection Act, even though the governor didn't want it during Katrina. I think any sort of reading of whether New Orleans could deliver governance, I think it was pretty clear that it could not. I mean, you had a mayor, in a hotel room on the 23rd floor, calling into radio stations asking for help. So that's the triggering event, is the sort of, is there a governance system that has broken down? In these cases, you have looting, you have violence, but the courts are open, the police departments are functioning, the mayor is not in hiding, the jails aren't on fire. You have individual things, but you haven't lost the functioning of your Republican form of government. So that's how most people think about it, in those two ways. So it's a judgment call, but there are standards.
Okay, well, this has been fantastic. For every question, I feel like Juliette probably had 10 to 15 more minutes that she could have spoken on each of them. So it's been a real tour de force. Let me, before we adjourn for the evening, let me just promote some of our upcoming events. On this Thursday, 6 o'clock, we have our cybersecurity expert, David Hoffman. Professor Hoffman's going to be leading a discussion with New York Times technology reporter Kashmir Hill on questions relating to facial recognition algorithms. And we promise not to take the video of you on Zoom and use them for facial recognition. That's a promise. And then Friday morning, a very nice and different kind of opportunity for our students to meet some of our MPP students who are coming from special forces and other national security careers, to talk to them about careers in the government and in national security. And then finally, next Thursday, September 10th at 5:30, we'll have our annual Around Close to 9/11 event, and we're going to discuss not Al-Qaeda related issues, but we're going to discuss something we touched on today, preventing white supremacist violent extremism and how it can be prevented. And we're going to have two experts. I'm sure Juliette knows both of them, David Gartenstein-Ross from the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, and Professor Errol Southers from USC. And Juliette, you're welcome to ping in and participate, or have your students, because those are two of the best experts there are on that topic, as well as you. So we are so grateful to you. I'm so glad to have spent an hour, a little time yesterday, and then an hour and so today chatting with you and learning from you, all of our students. We have a small token of appreciation that will be coming to you in the mail. And many of your colleagues at the Kennedy School, certainly Graham Allison, and they probably don't wear them because it says Duke on it, but this is the coveted, Susan Rice is getting one.
Good.
The coveted Duke American Grand Strategy t-shirt, which I hope you'll wear with great pride. And once Harvard gets bumped out of the NCAAs in the first round,
Exactly.
You got to have somebody to root for. So, go Blue Devils.
Thank you so much.
You'll have this to remember our time. And we're so grateful to you for your service and all you're doing to educate America through all your public engagement about these very important issues, and your, sensitive balance and candid approach towards all of them. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone and the team for organizing. It was great. And everyone, just be safe and wear a mask. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely. We're doing great here at Duke. We've had 17,000 tests and just a couple dozen cases.
I will say this, none of those stories make it out. We always hear the nightmare stories. Lots of people are in school in a variety of ways, hybrid or whatever. So, but it takes an effort. So that's great news.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Have a good night. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye.